This event is presented by Professor Mary Wilhelm from Art in the School of Visual and Performing Arts. Professor Wilhelm received her MFA in Visual Art, Painting, and Drawing from Arizona State University, and her BFA in Visual Arts with a focus in painting from Florida State. She just recently wrapped up an exhibition, a solo exhibition entitled Unfamiliar, that was at the Gunnison Art Center. And she serves as the director of art residency for the university, national exhibiting artist with multiple shows across the United States. Tonight's lecture is titled Fact or Fiction, the Story of the Horse in the American Southwest. And in her words, horses are a revered symbol in the American Southwest. This lecture explores the complex economic, cultural, and symbolic relationships that these equine companions have held within American culture. From their introduction by Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s to their portrayal in contemporary popular media, she'll examine how horses have impacted the narrative of America and how they can be used as a symbol in the ever-evolving political and cultural landscape of the United States. So help me in welcoming Professor Wilhelm.
I'm clapping for myself right now. So thank you. It's so funny, when I started this talk, I just submitted the title and then sort of the little bio about what it was going to be about. And I tried really, really hard throughout this entire time to sort of stick with the American Southwest. I was like, this is great, I live here, this will not be a difficult topic to cover at all. I was wrong. So what I'd like to say is that horses are globetrotters. Ha ha ha, ha ha. Funny, you can laugh, I'm really funny. And have had a really extensive history throughout the United States, particularly in the American Southwest. And this goes back 60 million years. So by attempting to narrow down this topic, I unfortunately kind of encompassed the totality of horses as a species, an evolutionary tract through history, essentially, evolutionary history. So what I'm going to say with that context is that there might be a little bit of generalization here. I thought that I was just starting in the Southwest and going to kind of focus on this, introduction of equus in the Spanish conquistadors. And I ended up going back in time 60 million years to our first dawn horse, because I learned some really fun things putting this talk together. So there might be a little bit of generalization, a little bit of skimming, and I'm not necessarily able to go into full depth with all of this as I really want to. There are portions of this PowerPoint that have been and probably will be at some point entirely, thought out, well-rounded talks in their own. But again, we're kind of speed running through the history of horses right now. So again, please pardon, I take full responsibility. I'm watching you wiggle over there, Nate. I take full responsibility for the skimming and the generalizations, but just understand, unless you want to be here for 6 hours, which I think all of us want to go home, unless I want to trap you here and just lock the doors, which I'm not going to do. Just understand there is a little bit of some simplification going on there. So yeah, so first things first, how do I move forward in this? Click, okay. All right, so on a personal note, I am 100% a horse girl. I used to do English when I was when I was real little. And this picture on your left, my right, is me with this horse named Rita. She was a flea-bit gray. She was not my favorite horse to ride. My favorite was a horse named Red. But I was trained in a style of riding called English riding. It's basically, if you're in the horse world, they do a lot of dressage. Their saddles are a little smaller. And they do show jumping and stuff like that. So I really started off at a very young age being super, super interested in horses. I couldn't continue riding past 3rd grade because my dad, love him to bits and pieces, is terrified of any animal that is more than 20% of his body weight. So he was like, I don't want my child around, these big animals. So I was kind of forced to quit. Still really love them. The picture on the right is an illegal photo that I took when I was in Vienna, Austria. Has anybody in here heard of the Lipizzans? Yeah. Okay. So if you are unfamiliar, the Lipizzans are this very, very special breed of horses that were, basically trained and developed for war. Because we are not using horses for warfare in, most of the time in this day and age, they are basically trained to do these military moves, but they are in this thing called like a little horse ballet. You're not supposed to take photos or videos, but I was like there on a research grant and just like pulled out my phone and was like, I'm probably never gonna be here again. I am taking a picture of these horses. So I was like, again, kind of obsessed. Like this was happening when I was an undergraduate, and I have kept this love of horses for, continuing into now. Like I'm 33 at this point. It has been with me my entire life. And horses have not only been like, integrated into my life in some capacity in real life, they are also something that I use in my work. So I have, these are some really, really early pieces. I mean, we're talking like high school. I've always been fascinated with animals, but I was like really interested in horses from a pretty early age and depicting them in my work. And again, these are from high school, so we're talking like 2011. And that love of this animal like never really, again, left me. I still think they're really cool. I love petting their noses. I think they're just like one of the most beautiful animals that has ever existed. And as a side note, they're really hard to draw. I had a joke in my MFA that if you could draw a horse, you just immediately got an MFA degree. It was just a thing. You are an artist, you get an MFA if you can draw a horse. So, using horses in my work started pretty early on. And it has kind of continued even, into 2016, 2017. And I need a little bit of context for these pieces. But when I was in again, like 2016, 2017, I started this particular piece. In 2015, after the Pulse shooting in Orlando, and it kind of triggered this sort of thought of reimagining the Four Horses of the Apocalypse. Now, in the Four Horses of the Apocalypse, there are 4 of them. I did 2 because 2 horses was enough for me. I got done with like these 2 paintings and I was like, I feel like my mind is getting blown. I don't think I can continue with this work. It was a lot of energy. It was a lot of trauma in some capacity. And it was a lot of just, it was just not a necessarily super happy series. I don't hate these paintings, but they were a lot to kind of complete. But while I was working on these 2 paintings, I was really very cognizant of the horses that I was using and the riders that were on the horses. So the horsemen, I actually did these in kind of reverse. This was the first horseman that I painted. This was the second one, but this one's the first horseman, and then this is the second horseman. So the first horseman is reimagined as the horseman of ignorance. The second horseman is the horseman of hate. And when I was imagining these animals and this relationship between rider and the horse, I was really very careful about not putting any symbology on the actual body of the animal. So the idea was, when I was in my ideal world where I had the energy to do all the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, there was going to be another series that kind of followed after this, where each horse has a different rider. And for the horseman of ignorance, the opposite of that would have been knowledge. The horseman of hate the rider would have been that of love. And what I was really kind of playing with was this idea of the horse as energy and as a tool that can be moved in a direction depending on whoever is controlling it. And this particular theme, whether I was aware of it or not, is something that kind of ends up playing into the history of the horse as this sort of cultural symbol. So now we get into the history of the horse. Oh no, wait, I forgot about this. So I've been using horses in my work for a while. And then I moved to Colorado. So when I came to Colorado, the first time that I was here, I remember I didn't know about Blucifer, the Blue Mustang, when I came here. I just come out from the airport and I'm in the Uber and I am, looking out and I see this just giant blue kind of demonic looking animal. And I'm like, what is that? Like, that is not the welcome I expected when I came to Colorado. I was completely confused. But I came back, my process of moving to Colorado, I'd actually, came here for a Red Rocks concert, the early summer, got this job, and then came out here. But it was really funny seeing the sculpture because, in my head, I associate horses with these, they're kind of loving animals, they're sort of flighty, but this one just looks straight up evil. So when I was looking into actually this sculpture, because I wanted to talk about it a little bit, and how Luis Jimenez was killed by it, it fell on him and crushed him. And how it's supposed to be this, again, symbol of freedom, but it looks kind of evil and oppressive. I found that actually Blucifer was supposed to be inspired by this story of the Blue Mustang. Has anybody in here heard of this? Okay, yeah. And supposedly this Blue Mustang was from the San Luis Valley. And it's this story of this, supposedly mythical horse that was like blue and knew where to take all of the horses for the sweetest grass, for the water, and could run so fast he could fly, and had glowing red eyes. So when I was looking at this, and this is like another depiction of this Blue Mustang. I personally think that as people living in the San Luis Valley, we should just claim Blucifer. He's ours. He's our Blue Mustang. He's from here. And just continue to accumulate really weird little symbols and make this the weirdest valley ever. But yeah, I got, it was just interesting to, again, have this, to move to Colorado and then be in the valley where supposedly this horse came from, or the story of it came from. So that's my little thing about, at least, my relationship with Blucifer. So now we're going to go and we're going to start talking about the history of horses. And in order to talk about the history of horses, we have to talk about the paleontology and the evolution and history of the bones of finding these animals. So we're going to start with a dead white guy. This is Othaniel Charles Marsh. Othaniel Charles Marsh was, in the 19th century, one of the main guys for finding bones. He was so big into finding bones and dinosaur bones. And during this period of time, and he was working at Yale, he was a paleontologist, there was this thing called the Bone Wars, which I like to mention, and this could be an entirely different talk in of itself. Excuse me. But he competed with this guy called Edward Drinker Cope to basically find the most bones. This guy had an obsession with bones, but he was the man, because he was so obsessed with bones, he ended up finding a lot of these bones that sort of looked like horses, and they were really, really tiny. And, again, was at the same time trying to undercut the privileges and funding for Edward Drinker Cope because they were in the Bone Wars, and it was absolutely insane. But he basically discovered the first horse. It's called Eohippus, the dawn horse. And in order to kind of understand our contemporary horses, we really have to go back in time and extend, and understand Eohippus. So, first thing we're going to talk about is evolution, very briefly. Evolution is not a straight line. It is a complicated branch of like tree where you might have one ancestor that branches off into 2 or 3. They die off, they keep going depending on the environment and the climate. And it's not necessarily like, again, like a straight line. So when we think about the evolution of horses, it's not like we went Eohippus, Mesohippus, and then like straight through to this. It was more like a tree that branched outwards. And a lot of these species of horses died off, came back, or, died off, and then continued to evolve depending on the climate and the area that they were located in. So the Dawn horse, the one that Othniel Marsh was found, actually began as this tiny, tiny little animal that was located and started off in the area that is now Wyoming and here, Colorado. So when I say I was like, oh, I'm going to focus on horses in the Southwest, I didn't know that the horse technically started here. I like to imagine that with Blucifer being supposedly from this valley, that Eohippus actually was from this valley as well. And again, just claiming the entire history of horses, because why not? No one was there. We'll never know. And they appeared about 60 million years ago. They were really tiny. They were about the size of cats, which I love the idea of having a cat-sized horse. I just think that would be super fun and super cute. And here it's like little hooves clip-clopping all over the place. And it was primarily a prey animal, ate brush and fruits, and was living in a time period when this area in Colorado was more heavily forested. So it wasn't the grazing animal that we necessarily know today. You'll see a couple names for Eohippus kind of floating around. That comes from like some shenanigans in the paleontology world, where an English paleontologist named Richard Owen thought that Eohippus was part of this other genus of horse. It's not. It's in its completely own class. It's honestly all very confusing, and bless scientists, because I'm not sure how they figure any of this stuff out. But Eohippus evolves in America about 60 million years ago. It's over here, it's partying, it's having a good time, it's continuing to evolve, and eventually, about, I think it was 55 million years ago? Yeah. Our little Dawn horse evolves and makes its first wave of migration all the way over into Russia, India, and Europe. Again, at this point, it's probably not Eohippus, it's some other animal. It's evolving. It's living its best life, It's getting probably hunted by a lot of other predators. And then about 34 million to 24 million years ago, they die off. All of the ones over in Russia and the Eurasian steppes and Europe and India, they're gone. Don't really know why. Probably some scientist has a good theory as to why. But horses stay alive in some capacity in some evolutionary species in North America. So they're chilling, they're walking on their ancestral ground. And about, I have to look at this, 2.6 million years ago, they go move over again. So we had 2 different waves of horses that went from North America over to Asia, Europe, and the Indian subcontinent. And these horses probably more resembled our modern horses today. They were probably bigger, eating grass, and were fitted to exist on plains and grasslands, essentially. So then about 11,000 years ago, something kind of funny happens. The horses in America all die off. They're just gone. There's a couple reasons they think for this. Horses were, at this time period, there was a really big, there was a lot of climate change going on, and first peoples were potentially arriving. They think it was potentially a combination of just climate change and maybe some hunting by first peoples. More than likely, it was climate change. There was at this point in time, 11,000 years ago, North America lost, let me check the exact number, 34 of its 47 large charismatic megafauna. Anybody want to guess what the last large charismatic megafauna of this time period that still exists is? Do you want to just say it, Nate? It is. It's the moose. The moose is the last large charismatic megafauna left over from the Ice Age. When you are looking at a moose, you are looking at an animal whose ancestors walked the same plains as mastodons, giant sloths, and like Siberian tigers. They are incredible animals, and I would do a talk on mooses also if I had the capacity. But that would get us off on a tangent. As much as they're ungulates, I'm here to talk about the horse. So horses die off in North America. So this is where our talk leaves the Southwest and actually goes over to Europe and Asia and the Indian subcontinent for a little bit. I swear we're not going to stay there for too long. I just need to talk about Proto-Indo-Europeans, and then we'll hop back over to North America. So horses at this period in time were not necessarily our companions, as in that we were riding them. They were primarily a source of food. We think this because when we look back at like cave art, or when early humans were making cave art, a lot of these caves where we find these paintings and drawings of these animals, we find remains of horses that have the evidence of being butchered on their bones. So despite the fact that they're not necessarily our companions that we're riding and like hanging out with, we are interacting with them from a very early age. They are one of probably our main food sources, and something that we've had a relationship with for thousands and thousands of years. So there are theories as to how the first horse got ridden, essentially. About 5,000 years ago, and this is my dramatic reenactment of what might have happened. This is somewhere on the Eurasian steppes. It's grassy. This is probably a nomadic tribal system of culture. And again, it's a theory. It's make-believe to a certain extent, but I could totally see people doing this. Horses, again, were primarily prey for early humans. And I'd like to imagine that there is, maybe one horse, sort of similar with dogs, probably one horse who just had this gene to be slightly less afraid of people. And early hunters, gatherers, whatever they were probably like, hey, this horse, it's letting us get really close to it. They're kind of interesting. What if you tried to ride it? Not me, because I'm going to get hurt, but you should definitely try to ride it. So definitely couldn't go bad at all. But this guy, I'm calling him Steve for right now. Steve goes, yeah, I'm going to try. I'm going to get on him. So gets on the horse, is like, yeah, this is great. I love this. Nothing could possibly ever go wrong. Is promptly yeeted off the back of a horse. I don't know if anybody's actually seen when you're trying to break a green horse. They don't normally really like that, even if they're like pretty friendly with you. And then Steve probably, I don't know, dies. I'm not quite sure how far the technology was for medical advances there, but this is what they think happened, potentially. That, again, we had these relationships with these animals, and that on some capacity, one horse, through evolutionary just sort of genetic weirdness, was slightly less afraid of people and allowed us to ride them. And this changed the course of human history. So, yeah, this is another meme that I probably didn't need in here, but I just thought was really funny. And it not only changed our history, but it completely changed the history of horses. So our modern equus, without humans, probably would have died out. They are evolutionary freaks. And just due to the fact that even in North America, they were on the decline and went extinct because of, again, either climate change or human hunting, probably a combo of both. They were on the decline, 5,000 years ago. And part of that is because for how big they are, how fast they go, and how much stamina they have, they evolved to survive off of grass. And grass, in terms of nutrients, it's just not very nutrient dense. It takes a lot for horses to eat the amount that they need to survive. If anybody in here owns a horse, they probably know how much they eat. Right, Jaden? Yeah. So they really developed these special teeth to eat grass and grew really large because, again, they need to graze and forage a lot for food. And if you're eating a food source that is, not very nutrient dense, you need to eat a lot of it. And, grew really large to basically go off into these colder climates and sort of expand its grazing range so it could eat more. They are built for speed. And they have an insane flight response. They are prey animals, so if they get freaked out by something, they run. But again, they're like an evolutionary anomaly. And for the size and stamina and speed that they go, they are huge. They are just massive animals. A lot of animals that run this fast and like have that kind, either run really fast, normally don't have very high stamina. And they're just super strange animals. So, again, without us like being willing to take care of these animals, nature was probably like, evolutionarily, you don't really make any sense, so we're going to put you on the decline. So, yeah. And also, due to just sort of the behavioral predisposition of horses, they were more open to being domesticated. So scientists have certain animals that they're just primed for domestication. They're just easier to domesticate. And horses, because they are inherently understand sort of submission, signals of supremacy, and chains of command, they were kind of primed to really be domesticated. When you sit on a horse, you are essentially taking over the position of a stallion in a herd. For those of you who are not super familiar with horse herd dynamics, stallions are generally like the one male. They'll have like a harem of females, and there's some other complicated sort of like hierarchies that happen within there, and there's some flexibility, but that's kind of the basic structure. Stallions sort of in command, and the mares are more or less kind of not necessarily submissive, but they are, they understand that there's like a hierarchy there. Having these animals understand these kind of like hierarchies made them really good for like, military movements and cavalry. And again, made them primed for domestication, essentially. Do you have any questions so far? Okay. So this domestication of horses was given this really fun term that I like called the Centaurian Pact. It felt very Star Wars, which is why I gave it a nice little Star Wars background. But essentially, this Centaurian Pact says that in exchange for food and care, horses provided humans with transportation, more efficient means for agriculture, and more efficient means for warfare. And that's what brings us to our Proto-Indo-Europeans. So around the time of the domestication of horses, so again, about 4,000, 5,000 years ago, this is a lot of it is theory. We're not really sure. We just know the domestication of horses coincides with this Proto-Indo-European culture. They think that these Proto-Indo-Europeans were the first to probably domesticate horses and not only use them as a tool for increasing trade, because again, if you have a horse, you can go a little bit faster. They have really high stamina. They can go for a really long time than, my two little legs can carry me. And they increased trade, but also increased warfare between different people. So if you had a cavalry or like a really basic cavalry, you already had an advantage over your opponents. And if your opponents have not domesticated horses, you have faster travel, you have a really big animal that's not going to be super fun to like get run over with, and the ability to transport weapons and humans much faster. Again, they think that this might have happened because there's DNA evidence that these cultures that were, hadn't domesticated the horses, that weren't Proto-Indo-Europeans, their DNA gets kind of like wiped after this expansion happens. So they think it was probably warfare, and that the Proto-Indo-Europeans really killed off a lot of these other cultures. And the other thought is that, again, theory, is that the Proto-Indo-Europeans' cultural structure was more patriarchal and was based on a system of accumulating wealth. So accumulating horses and accumulating land. Basically, baby capitalism, essentially. So after the Proto-Indo-Europeans pop over and kind of take over a fair amount of Asia and Europe into down south, and I can't get into all the rest of this. So, like, basically, lots of stuff happens. The stirrup gets invented in China, makes heavy cavalry in medieval times, like, even possible. And I can't talk to you about any of that because I'm already at 6 o'clock, and that's going to be, again, at least another hour. So we're going to, like, fast forward through time, much, much later. And go to the Spanish conquistadors. So in the 1530s, 1600s, horses returned to America. They are not eohippus. They are our modern equus, and they come in the form of these horses used to carry the Spanish conquistadors. There's a book called Guns, Steel, and Germs that talks about guns, steels, and germs in terms of this colonization of North America and Central America. But the other tagline to this was, in this other book that I was reading, says it should really be guns, steels, germs, and horses. Horses, again, big advantage if you're fighting other humans because they're just larger animals with higher stamina and speed, and not super fun if you get kicked by one. But the Spanish conquistadors brought horses back to America. Completely different form, though. And I took this quote from Bitter Collie. It's kind of, I was organizing this, not sure it should be here, but I just really liked it. A lot of the apparel, training customs, and techniques of equestrian sports are actually drawn from the history of military conquest, and therefore a history of kind of colonial domination. But when these horses got brought to North America, the Native Americans and the indigenous people here saw these animals and did learn to ride them. There's a lot of Western colonizers, once they kind of came up to America, associate that time period, the 1800s, with the introduction of horses into the Southwest, but it was really way before that. It's like 16th century. They were really compatible with Plains Indian lifestyles. And in a similar way, again, increased agriculture, increased hunting, and increased, the ability to trade with other tribes. And when Hernan Cortez, brought horses into Central America to defeat the Aztec, they kind of started this spread up through Mexico and back into the plains of North America, and really integrated themselves with the Native American culture. And again, particularly with cultures that were already in the optimum grazing and feeding ground for horses, which was the plains. So a lot of Comanches, the Shoshones, the Sioux are really big, have a really big horse culture. And again, they were really fully integrated by the time that Manifest Destiny and Western colonizers from America, or the then established America, were moving out west. And this relationship still plays into today. There are a lot of still horse, this is one of my most interesting ones to watch, but also the one that gives me the most anxiety is relay racing. But this relationship with horses has continued up until contemporary times. And again, this is another rabbit hole that I could have fallen down, and I did, but I can't talk about everything. There's a book called Horse Nation that really covers a lot more of this really interesting topic. But yeah, I just can't talk about it. I'm so sorry. Maybe that'll be another talk. And the other thing about it too is when we think about horses, particularly in the relationship to America and this Southwest, there's really this myth of the American cowboy. And it's normally depicted, in contemporary, media as this sort of lone, solitary, white, masculine American cowboy, when the reality of the situation is a quarter of, the term cowboy is actually a term that was primarily used for cow, like people who were doing ranching that were indigenous or black, and white cow, like white people that were working on ranches preferred the term cow hand, or this one, which is cow puncher, which I just found super funny because I was like, what are they doing to these animals? Are you just going up and decking a cow? So even the term cowboy has, it's associated with this white, kind of Clint Eastwood figure, but was really used to describe people of color and indigenous people who were working out at ranches at this time. Cowboys were a lot more diverse. They think about a quarter of them and probably more were actually people of color and indigenous. And a lot of people, or a lot of Native Americans, particularly those on the plains, were well equipped to work with horses because, again, they were already fully integrated into their culture. So they kind of transitioned really easily into doing this sort of like ranching work. Another quote from Bitter Kali that I'm not going to put up there is the cowboy was not necessarily a figure of victory and indestructibility, but a tragic symbol of the devastation caused by colonial expansion and the lies of American exceptionalism. Because again, when we think about the horse, even in the terms of just looking at it from the interactions of like Native Americans versus the usage of Western colonizers to dominate other cultures, it did provide Native Americans with, better hunting, trade, and essentially this kind of like freedom to move faster across the plains. But at the same time, this animal was also used by Western colonizers as a tool for domination. So it's got this kind of like dual nature in there that was really sort of interesting to analyze as I was kind of digging into the history a little bit more. And that duality like still plays into some relationships today. So now we're going to flip back to my work for a real hot minute. So this particular painting, I actually started like when I first moved to Colorado and got the job at Adams State. And I've been particularly interested in coyotes up until this point, but when I moved out here, my sort of focus shifted, and I didn't really notice it until I was looking at this particular painting. And honestly, the shift was pretty subtle. And looking at this now, I can see my own focus on animals changing. And this particular piece really dealt with kind of my attempt at dealing with the complicated history of an American Southwest and the myth of manifest destiny and what happens when a being comes into a space where they might not necessarily, quote unquote, belong. In a lot of ways, it was my way of grappling with colonialism and its effect upon the ecology and indigenous cultures of North America. Do I necessarily totally think it was the most nuanced? No, but I feel like as an artist and as a painter, every time I do a painting, I'm always like, I could have changed that. I could have done something better. But it was, kind of grappling with this false whitewashed mythos of the cowboy and playing out this drama through the figure of the horse. There's also a critique on mainstream whitewashed spiritual culture in there, but that's a totally different tangent. So in contemporary culture, there's kind of this shifting perspective and expanding perspective on how horses function. Again, horses were primarily, in a lot of ways, military, like really used for like military and trade and agriculture. And in all sections of those where we have, transportation, we have cars. Agriculture, we have like, a lot of tractors and mechanical devices that make producing food more efficient than a horse would be. And then warfare, we're not really using horses a ton at all anymore. There are some very specific instances depending on sort of where you are, but for the most part, not really. So I kind of listed some of the things that I saw horses being used for, and I'll kind of talk about some of these individually. So I'm going to bring up this book, Mounted by Bitter Kali. This particular book, so at this point in time when I was doing this research for this talk, and in my exploration of the role of horses and their kind of place in contemporary culture, I was getting sort of stuck because a lot of the writers that I was looking at, not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them were men, and a lot of them were particularly white men. So I really was looking for sort of a different perspective. And this is a shout out, but also a tiny bit of a loving warning. I have a really great relationship with a lot of the booksellers at Narrow Gauge. It's one of my favorite stores here in town. And I've learned that if you go to the bookstore and you talk and you get to know the booksellers, they're going to learn what you like. And when they learn what you like, they're going to start buying books that they think you're going to buy. So I went into Narrow Gauge one day, and I walk in, and one of the booksellers is like, "Mary, we got a book that we think you might like." And I was like, "Okay." And they're like, "It's about horses." And I was like, "Yeah, you are absolutely 100% right. I will be buying that book." And it's this book called Mounted by Bitter Collie. And part of the reason that I gravitated towards this was this was a writer who was queer, who was writing about their experience with horses growing up, essentially. They are a person of color, they are trans, and they were a really refreshing sort of take on just horses as a cultural symbol. It's a series of short essays. I would definitely recommend reading it. I don't cover hardly, it's such a good book. It's really short, but it's so good. I can't cover nearly all of it in depth as I'd like to. But anyways, shout out to Narrow Gauge. Love you guys. You're the best. And it really explores the interactions between horses and Black communities. And the first essay that Collie writes about is the usage of horses by slaves to escape from plantations. So in their book on page 3, because this is like their first essay, they write that the escaped slaves who stole horses were exercising the genius of fugitivity, using the mundane to achieve the extraordinary. Stealing horses was an act that shattered the illusion of plantation owners' control over their own property. It was, again, using this horse that was being used as a symbol of oppression against a group of people as not only, in flipping that script into a tool of freedom, essentially. So, again, this duality of horses as both oppression and freedom played a pretty significant role when I was reading this book. And we see this sort of play out today in the usage of horses by mounted police officers, and also in these concrete cowboys, which are Black communities that take horses and use them in urban environments to build community. Another topic that I totally wish I could get more into, but I can't. And are flipping the script of these animals being used in these oppressive ways and using it as a mode of freedom for them. Really, really cool. There is a movie on Netflix called Concrete Cowboys that features Idris Elba that kind of deals with some of the political and cultural ramifications of using horses in urban spaces. Yeah. I'm trying to see if there's anything else that I wrote there, but I don't think so. Okay. Just some other pictures. I just think that some of the photography that happens with these animals, again, when I was growing up, I associated horses with really outdoorsy spaces, and seeing them in really urban settings like cities is just super cool to me. They used to be more used in cities. They're not as much anymore. But yeah. So I had to bring up the Barbie movie a little bit. Ken, if anybody has not seen this movie, Ken basically goes into the real world, discovers horses and cowboys, takes it back to Barbie land, and essentially dominates all of the Barbie Dreamland houses with cowboy and horse paraphernalia. And what I thought was really interesting, because as much as this movie was really talking about, using this mythology of the American cowboy as a symbol of patriarchy, it's still really centered around the horse, because the horse was the tool that was kind of the tipping point as to whether or not, this was going to succeed or not succeed. And then when Ken finds out that the patriarchy isn't about horses, he kind of, loses interest anyways. But this drama and this usage of horses plays into a lot of our contemporary culture today. We think we have pants because you can't necessarily super successfully get onto a horse in a skirt or a dress, and to prevent chafing on your thighs. We think that we have pants because they were meant to ride, help us ride horses and not get rashes everywhere. So when you see a horse, you can look at them. If you like pants, you'd be like, thank you, horse. Thank you for pants. Yeah. So the consequence of expanding west, the painting that I'd shown a few slides ago, again, was a couple-year-old painting. This is my most recent one that I'm willing to show you that involves a horse. The other one is not done. I was talking to the graphic design professor for and humming and hawing. I'm like, do I bring the other painting? And yeah, she's nodding right now, but no, I'm hiding it from you all. But this is a piece called Inundata. It's part of a body of work. Actually, it's part of two body of works. I'm still kind of fudging with the name a little bit, but it's called Relic or Reliquary, and the other body of work is called Inheritance. Still kind of working on the name. We're exploring this idea of permanence to the animal body. The horse is kind of like, when we're thinking about horses, and when I was thinking about it, I was really thinking about monuments. When I came up for the idea of this painting, a lot of monuments in the South that depicted generals from the Confederate Army were being taken down. And I saw this meme that was like, just remove the general, but keep the horse. Like, the horse didn't do anything, just keep the horse. And I was really fascinated with this idea of, again, this animal being associated with power, freedom. And again, if you've ever met a horse, they're, depending on the horse, they're kind of flighty. They colic really easily. They're very sensitive animals. And I just always think there's this interesting sort of irony of using this animal that, again, is very sensitive as this symbol of power and permanence. And this illusion of sort of the permanence of patriarchy and capitalism. And again, a lot of statues of horses exist, and I always look at them and go, these animals are so freaking sensitive, and we're going extinct, and the only reason they survive now is primarily the care of humans. But they really sort of, again, represent this kind of, in terms of statuary, represent this kind of domination. So when I was, thinking about this painting, I was like, do I depict the horse as a statue or a living animal? And I painted the horse as a living animal, alive, breathing, but in the pose of one of these monuments, essentially. And as this horse is posing and trying to imitate this permanent idea and this statuary, the water's rising, there are alligators swimming all around it, and the clouds are coming in. And I think probably one of the most difficult things that, people deal with is this idea of change, and that things happen and change in times, politics, climates change, and that change can be terrifying and scary, and that nothing stays forever. But that we, in this attempt to build these monuments, even Lucifer, who I love deeply, dearly, they're not permanent. At some point they will fall down. And I was using the horse in contrast with alligators because, one, weirdly enough, we have wild horses in this valley and also alligators. And as someone from Florida, when I moved here, I didn't understand that. I was I came down from Salida, whatever, and I was going by the alligator farm being why is this here? I thought I moved from the swamp. Why? But the thing about alligators that I think is really interesting is they've existed longer than the Dawn horse. They have existed in some capacity since dinosaurs. So, this idea, if there's any animal that's going to survive, the apocalypse or climate change, it's going to be an alligator. In contrasting that with, again, these horses, which are used as this symbol of power and freedom, how they would actually react to a great climate, change or disaster, is they would probably die out. So this painting was really kind of dealing with that. And again, inspired by the SLV, and I moved out here, you guys, and I was like, it's so interesting, but so weird. Why are there alligators? And but also really thinking about the relationship with horses and, that aren't like not necessarily like perpetuating systems of oppression and violence. Like, how do we change our relationship with horses? And by changing our relationships with horses in some way, sort of change the relationship with culture and other people. So this is already kind of starting to happen with this sort of theory of equine therapy. I was at CSU not too long ago. They have a pretty big biology veterinary program there. And two of the women were like, hey, do you want to come volunteer? And I was like, if you weren't 3.5 hours away, I would 100% come volunteer with your equine therapy program. But these horses, these animals that have been used as these tools of domination and oppression in so many instances throughout history are now being used as these animals of assisted therapy. There isn't a ton of research about how effective it necessarily is, but with horses being domesticated, they're kind of like dogs. When animals are around and like bred for a specific purpose for long enough, their traits start to become things that like are more aligned with people. There is an entire study about how horses are very, very sensitive to human emotions. They have, again, through this process of breeding and selective, essentially selective evolution by people, they're pretty primed to have a variation of relationships with humans. So they've been pulled into this world of animal-assisted therapy. And again, because they are so sensitive to human emotions, they make, in theory, really great animals for emotional regulation, social interaction, and in some cases they think they help help a lot with PTSD symptoms. And I could kind of see this being a thing. As someone who is in therapy, often the most important part of a therapeutic process is the therapeutic relationship. It is the relationship that you have with your therapist where you find the most healing. The idea with therapy is that you are held in a non-judgmental, safe space where you can tell your deepest, darkest secrets, and someone goes, I'll listen to you. And this kind of plays out in this sort of relationship with horses, maybe not necessarily in a human capacity. A horse can't look at you and be like, uh-huh, and respond to give you advice or listen to you and ask very pertinent questions. But they are ideally, if you have a really good horse, they're not necessarily super judgmental. They're kind of they're hopefully, if they're not freaking out on you, they are these really safe spaces for people to sort of connect with a living being where they might not necessarily feel safe connecting with another person. And through that safety, find healing. So I really like to think about how we can use horses as this kind of model for, again, not necessarily, not erasing their past, but just re-envisioning how we can use them now. And I was looking at this sort of really interesting guy. His name is Luis Soriano. He's a teacher in La Gloria, Colombia. And he created this mobile library with his donkeys. He works in a really rural area, so what he does is he gets these all these books, and he uses his donkeys to help carry them to villages that might not necessarily have a ton of access to reading materials and education. So he's using these animals to sort of increase accessibility to education and reading materials. And I guess my thought is, because we're in the San Luis Valley, we already have this deep history with horses. Instead of maybe not using them necessarily just for transportation or warfare, rethinking them as just a question of what if they brought art instead. So this is my pie in the sky idea that will it ever happen? I don't know, but I like to envision this artist residency. That's a traveling residency with these horses and carts. It's going to be a blue horse with glowing red eyes. I'm going to freak everybody out. And you have the person who's driving, helping the horse, probably someone who's very knowledgeable of that. But at the same time, you have maybe an artist going around. And again, bringing art and portable artist workshops and accessibility to people who aren't, because we're not in the big city, we're just not. We don't have accessibility to like Meow Wolf and a lot of galleries. And this is just a way to sort of bring art to people. And I find horses to be really accessible. Like I'm just like imagine someone driving, if you're like, going up through the valley and you see someone on a horse cart with like, you'd probably be like, what are they even doing? And it just makes, at least for me, I would be super curious about that and probably be super annoying. Like, how are you? Why are you? What is this even? But I just think it would be really interesting and in some ways just rethink the relationship between horses and humans that, again, isn't stuck or associated as much with this system of oppression and violence. And again, continuing to expand the role of the horse into area of creativity, accessibility, art, and sort of healing. Oh my goodness, it's 6:30, wow, or 6:28, I got to the end. So, I've by no means covered even half of what horses means to different cultures. So again, like I said at the beginning, the generalizations, I take full responsibility for. I can't go as in depth as I'd like to. The history of horses is as expansive and as nuanced as our own. There is no way I can encapsulate that in one 45-minute to an hour talk. I tried. I tried my best. But hopefully at the end of the day, you've kind of learned something new. Lucifer might have started here. Horses might have started here. We should use horses for art because they're really nice animals and I like them a lot. Thank you for your time, and I hope that was interesting. Do you have any questions or thoughts on life?
I had talked to people who grew up in the valley and they know nothing about the myth of the horses that was related to Lucifer. I had actually heard that there was a band of horses that come down from Mount Blanca. And their hooves, when they strike the ground, there's light and sparks. And that's what the myth is that he's trying to capture with Lucifer.
Yeah.
The horses were actually here long before the horses that the conquistadors had left.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that's when I got in, when I saw that, I was like, this is something that I think someone needs to do a little bit more research into, because even that sort of oh, it's based in the San Luis Valley, I was trying really hard to figure out what, how it was connected very specifically, how could I trace that? But yeah, I mean, horses, who knows? There might have been a really early horse that had been here. They didn't die out that long ago. Again, 11,000 years ago, in the span of evolutionary time is a blink, and there probably were, again, modern horses that did live here, that those stories got passed down. So I definitely think that there is still that kind of remnant of horses, because again, 11,000 years, not that long. Yeah, so I just thought that was super interesting. Yes? Mm-hmm.
They could trace that DNA in the modern Mustang population.
Mm-hmm.
So he was part of that study they published in Science a couple of years ago. But the valley is also the central point for diffusion of Spanish horses at Taos Pueblo.
I saw that, and I thought that was really interesting, because they talk a little bit about the book that I was reading was this. It's called Galloping: A Human History of Horses. It's really, really good. Timothy Weingard is actually in Colorado. I was going to shoot him an email and be super annoying to him. Yeah, I'm probably going to. He's very excited. People love to talk about their own work. I always tell my students, if you want to email these people who write these books, they will probably love to talk to you if you have questions for them. But yeah, no, I definitely would be interested in talking to that human, because that wouldn't surprise me. Again, the United States of America is huge. They might have survived. There was theories that giant ground sloths existed in South America and might still be down there. We just haven't found them yet. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just picking up on your thought about the horse as a symbol of oppression and or freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I was associated with an art gallery at a law school. in California, and one of the shows that we did was on mass incarceration.
Mhm.
And the curator had a section on horses, and in his research, he told me that often incarcerated indigenous people would draw horses,
Mhm.
and it was the idea of freedom,
Mhm.
and it was really, he said, overrepresented in the art of incarcerated native.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know. Again, there's like so many rabbit holes with horses that you can just fall down. Like they're such an interesting animal, and their relationship with people is a lot. Like there's so much there. Yeah.
I have more of a comment. Thank you.
Okay, you're
for your
welcome.
presentation. And my comment is from the perspective of an ASU employee who's also a community member
Mhm.
who likes to support when I can these faculty lectures.
Mhm.
I've always been surprised to come when I'm not expecting to be interested,
Mhm.
and then I get blown away. I couldn't think of anything more boring to me than horses in the Southwest.
Surprise!
I'm from Los Angeles County, by the way.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm very happy to be in the San Luis Valley. I came here on purpose from Santa Barbara. However, I got here and immediately it was nothing like I expected your presentation.
Mhm.
It was very educational, entertaining, loved your art,
Thanks.
and I'm just so happy I came. There was a coworker of mine who intended to come, and I was like, I'm not going. That's boring. He forgot about it. And I'm here, and I'm going to tell him all about it. So thank you.
Well, you see me like up here performing, and you don't see the 20 minutes before where I'm like, I hate my life. I'm gonna cancel. I'm not doing it. Like, why did I choose to do that? So I appreciate that comment. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, if you want to come back and do some rabbit holes,
Uh-huh.
that would be great. And I would love to hear about the Mustangs too. Actually, I thought that was going to be one of the rabbit holes you were going to do.
I would love to.
About the Mustangs and maybe some of the history of that or some of the challenges that they currently have. But I'd like to ask, is there a place online that we can see your work?
Yeah, so marycwilhelm.com. That's where my work is. I haven't updated the photos on my website in a hot minute, so a lot of the horse paintings, you get to see those special during this talk. I'm still working on kind of updating it, but yeah, that's where the rest of my work is. I have a studio on East Campus as well, and occasionally when we do studio tours, I'll like open it up, and you know, if you want to come by at any point, you're more than welcome to see my other horse paintings, the one that I didn't bring today, that my graphic design professor said I should have. She's behind you, so she's giggling at me. Yeah. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'd love to not awkwardly stand here, so I'm going to get down. Thank you. Thank you. So was it as good or better than the coyote one?